Hey guys, tonight we begin with the hush between two breaths, the creak of wood as it shifts in the cold, and the gentle crackle of a fire that's not quite enough dot, not a saga, not a sword, but a room, dim, low-ceilinged, smelling of ash, wool, and something like smoked fish. A space where people didn't conquer, they simply survived dot. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing, only if it feels right, because this is not the story of Viking raids or gods with thunder hammers. It is the story of a blanket shared by two tired people who have nothing left to say. It is the way smoke curls through a roof hole and escapes into sky like a secret never told. It is the softness of hands that have carried buckets, chopped bark, and swaddled a child, and still, somehow, reach for another hand in the dark. Let me know where you're watching from. What time is it for you? Tonight, we'll drift not through glory, but through simplicity, into rooms no saga ever entered, spaces full of straw, silence, and the occasional sigh. We'll explore what it meant to be close, to feel warmth, not from a fire or a god, but from someone sleeping beside you. Someone you may or may not have chosen. Someone who may or may not love you. But someone nonetheless. The Norse world was not just one of violence. It was also one of waiting. Waiting for spring, waiting for childbirth, waiting for the wind to settle. And in that stillness, in those unseen pauses of history, there was love, or something like it dot. So pull your blanket up just a little closer. Let the outside world soften. We're about to enter a place where intimacy wasn't lit with candles, but with breath, where bodies were not sculpted, but shivering, and where history sleeps not in kings, but in kitchens. And that brings us to chapter 1, a story that begins not with a bang, but with a whisper of warmth. The cold did not arrive all at once. It crept in, through the cracks in the wood, through the thatch above, under the threshold where damp earth gave no warning. It did not roar. It whispered. A still, dry kind of cold that settled between joints and lingered behind the ribs. By the time you noticed it, it was already inside. They had one answer. Just one. A fire. Small, reluctant, smoky. It lived not in a fireplace, but in a sunken pit, in the center of everything. The room was built around it like a child curled around. A candle. In the longhouse, the hearth was the sun, and all life orbited quietly around its flicker. Ashes thickened underfoot with each passing day, and no one thought to sweep them anymore. The soot painted the ceiling, blackened the beams, marked the seasons better than the sky ever could dot in the morning. Someone would prod it. Not quickly, never quickly. Just a slow stir with a charred stick. A prayer in motion. Please catch, please stay. Please burn long enough to keep the baby's toes warm. Long enough to keep the soup liquid. Long enough to keep death outside. The door. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft light below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. They didn't speak to the fire, but they noticed when it grew sullen, when it hissed and spat like it too had grown tired of surviving. Wood was precious, bark more valuable than gold some winters. Wet logs hissed and smoked, filling the house with tears that didn't come from sorrow, but from survival. They'd burn anything, bones, dung, even old rope, and still the cold pressed in. The floor was earth, cold, crushed dirt packed by footfall and time. It held the chill like a memory. Blankets were shared, not out of romance, but arithmetic. Two bodies meant less heat lost. That was the first equation every child learned. At night, the house did not sleep. It sighed. It popped, groaned, breathed like a tired animal. Somewhere, someone turned over. Somewhere, an ember blinked once and died. When wind slipped in, and it always did, the walls whispered. The thatch shifted like an old woman brushing her hair in the dark. The children slept closest to the fire, elders next. The outer edges were for the stronger ones. And beyond them, the dogs. And beyond the dogs, the cold dot no one had their own. Bed, no one wanted one. To sleep alone was to flirt with frost. To sleep alone was punishment. Even the unloved were allowed a shared skin. Warmth was not a gift. It was policy. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, a mother would wake. Not from a sound, but a lack of one. A silence where breath used to be. Her hand would reach through the dark, not for comfort, but for confirmation. And if she found skin still warm, she'd exhale like she'd been holding it all winter. The fire burned low. It always did, not because they didn't know how to build it higher, but because they couldn't spare the wood, or the smoke, or the light, which lured things, people, spirits, memories. So they kept it small. You might think that this would make everything sad, and sometimes it did, but other times, it made everything feel holy. A piece of driftwood crackling into light could hold more wonder than a sunrise. A flickering flame reflected in the eyes of someone you'd forgotten how to love could look, just for a second, like something worth remembering. And in that moment, warmth was something more than temperature. It was connection. Outside, frost, curled on the edges of the door, like fingers too timid to knock. Inside, the air was thick with old smoke and old stories, none of them spoken, just carried on clothes and hair and breath. There were no grand gestures, no ceremonies. But when someone threw a log on the fire without being asked, and you noticed that the warmth now reached your toes, that was affection. That was something like love. That was how the Norse kept from freezing by lighting something small and keeping it alive. They were not sculpted. Those Viking bodies, they were stitched pieced together by work, weather, and wear, layered in cloth that had been patched a dozen times, sleeves mended with thread that barely matched, knees darkened from years of kneeling near fire pits, over wet soil, under winter roofs. A Viking body was not something to be admired. It was something to be endured. Their beauty was not the kind written in sagas. It lived quietly in calluses, in backs that bent but did not break, in arms that had carried too many buckets too. Many children, too many winters. A man's chest did not gleam. It itched. It pressed against rough tunics made from woven wool, always a little damp, always a little too tight around the shoulders. His skin cracked in winter. His fingers bled from rope and frost. Still, he smiled sometimes, laughed even. When he did, it echoed like warmth on stone. The women, they were softer, but only where softness was allowed. Their hands were hard, as spoons. Their hips bore the weight of gathering, of birthing, of standing for hours without rest. Their hair might have smelled of smoke, of dried herbs, or sometimes fish, but beneath that was the faint trace of something sweet, like dried berries crushed into combs. They did not look like the gods, but then, gods had never dug potatoes from frozen dirt, or woven shirts by moonlight, or stayed up 3 nights in a row to hold a coughing child. These bodies knew things the gods never could, and they dressed not for glory, but for survival. The tunics were long, the cloaks heavy. Some wore furs. Others, only layers and layers of cloth sewn together like old memories. A sleeve from a cousin. A hem once owned by a grandmother. Every garment told a story, not of fashion, but of family. There were belts, mostly leather, some plaited rope. They didn't cinch for style. They cinched because otherwise everything would fall off. Underneath, if there was anything underneath, it was rough linen, scratchy and stale, washed rarely and aired even less. They shivered often. The cold was not a guest, it was a tenant. It lived in joints, in marrow, in a place his cloth could never reach. There was no illusion of constant warmth, only the hope that today it would be bearable. And yet, in the right light, something like beauty shimmered dot, not the beauty of statues, but the beauty of effort, of living, of surviving with dignity, even when everything itched and nothing quite fit, and the wind found its way down your collar anyway. When they stood still, say, to listen to a raven's call, or to rest their arms from spinning wool, you could see it, the outline of a strength that did not boast, a grace made not of elegance, but endurance. There were no mirrors. The polished metal was too precious. And besides, there was no time. You did not ask, do I look good? You asked, is it warm enough? And if the answer was yes, that was beauty. Enough dot sometimes, at festivals or gatherings, they would try. A braid ear, a bone comb, a pendant made of glass. And someone would notice, not in words, but in a longer glance across the firelight, a half smile, a pause in conversation, a way of saying, I see you, even when your hands are cracked and your cheeks are wind-burnt dot in those moments. The shivering stopped, or rather it didn't matter. They danced, slowly, awkwardly, sometimes offbeat, bodies that were stiff from labor loosened just enough to remember what it was like to move without burden, to be held without being asked to carry something first dot, and if, later, two of those bodies pressed together in the dark, it was not always passion. Sometimes it was the need to be reminded that under all those layers, all of that stitching, there was still skin, still breath, still a person who wanted to be touched like they weren't just surviving, they were stitched. But even stitches can unravel and be tied again and wear soft with time. Their bodies were not temples, they were shelters, drafty, warm, patched with love and effort. And like the longhouses they lived in, they creaked when the wind blew, but they stood. And that was enough. The bed was not a place of luxury. It was a place of negotiation. Dot it negotiated with cold, with discomfort, with aching backs and early mornings. It offered no promises, only chances. A chance to rest, to warm, to forget. For a few hours that outside, the wind still howled, and winter still waited dot. It wasn't even always a bed. Sometimes it was straw laid across bare dirt. Sometimes it was wood slats softened by old wool. Sometimes it was simply a place on the floor nearest the fire, that sacred, flickering source of everything dot. There were no mattresses as we know them, no fluff, no foam, just bundles of hay wrapped in linen or fur. The hay poked, itched, shifted. Sometimes it carried small things, insects, seeds, memories of where it had come from. But it was warm, or warm enough, and that was the only requirement. Blankets were a precious thing. Most were made of wool, thick, coarse, heavy. They smelled of animals and smoke, of days spent spinning, weaving, stitching. A blanket was never just fabric, it was labor. Days of hands working rhythmically by firelight, making something that would be touched every night, possibly for years. They didn't sleep alone, not if they could help it. Sleep was communal, defensive. It held off cold, fear, and loneliness all at once. To be offered space in a bed was not just kindness, it was trust. Warmth shared was warmth multiplied. Two people curled under one blanket were not always lovers. Sometimes they were siblings, or strangers, or a widow and her niece. But the warmth passed between them just the same, soft and quiet as breath. And if they were lovers, if closeness came with tenderness, then that bed became something different, not grand, not indulgent, but sacred in its own small way. They curled toward each other because there was no room to do otherwise. But sometimes they stayed there because they wanted to. There was no privacy, not really. The longhouse was one room. Life, Death, eating, working, sleeping, all in the same shared air. If there was a curtain, it was a luxury. A fur draped from the rafters, a hanging blanket stiff with soot. Even then, you could hear everything. Every shift, every sigh, every whisper in the dark dot, so they learned silence. Or they learned to ignore. Respect was not in what you couldn't hear. It was in what you didn't mention. They lay on their sides, curled like commas. The fire's heat didn't reach every corner, and so they became their own furnaces. Sometimes arms wrapped around ribs, not in romance, but in self-preservation. Sometimes toes brushed by accident or on purpose, testing if the other person was still awake. A child might fall asleep between parents. A dog might press close to someone's spine. A baby, swaddled in wool, might be laid between two bodies, not just to sleep, but to survive. And in the stillness, there were sounds not of snoring, though that happened, but of breath, of fabric shifting, of someone murmuring in sleep, of the fire settling with a sigh of its own, of a world exhaling just long enough to allow rest. The beds were short. People slept curled not just because of the cold, but because the space demanded it. Long limbs folded, tall backs hunched. Sleep was not a sprawl. It was containment and dreams. Dreams had to fit within that frame. Sometimes a person would wake in the middle of the night, not from a nightmare, but from a feeling. The fire had died. The cold had crept in. Or maybe it was the absence of the other body. Warmth gone, a weight missing. They'd reach out, and sometimes find nothing. That kind of absence stayed with you, so when they lay down the next night, they did so a little closer. A little more willing to share the blanket, even if it left one shoulder bare. Beds weren't always soft, but they were safe, or safe enough. And that mattered more in the mornings, when the frost clung to the corners of the room and breath still misted in the air. The bed was hardest to leave, not because it was comfortable, but because it was warmer than anything else. Leaving it meant beginning again. The fire, the chores, the silence. And so they lingered. Just a minute. Just long enough to remember that bodies could be close and life could be still. And for this one moment, nothing was required in those beds. People were not warriors or farmers or wives. They were simply tired creatures hoping to wake up with enough warmth to keep going. And often, they did. Love, in the Viking world, didn't announce itself. It arrived like steam curling from a cup, slow, invisible at first, vanishing almost as soon as it was noticed. It did not shout. It did not sing. It whispered. From across a crowded hall, behind the haze of wood smoke and laughter, there were no roses, no serenades, but there were glances, small, stolen, and often ignored until they weren't. He might look up from his carving just a little too long. She might offer him a cup before anyone else. These gestures were ordinary, so ordinary that no one dared comment on them. But in the quiet language of warmth and winter, they meant everything. A brush of fingers while handing over a bowl. A shared joke with no words. A shoulder leaned on, only half accidentally, when the benches grew crowded. Courtship, for them, was not a storm. It was kindling, the kind that took time to catch. There were gatherings, feasts, days of trading, drinking, games. These were opportunities, but not just for commerce or ale. They were moments when hands might linger on hands, when someone might pluck a comb from their own belt and offer it silently. A gift that said, "I've noticed your hair, and I've thought about it more than I should." And when someone braided their hair just a little more carefully, it was rarely for the gods. Flirting was rarely bold, but it was clever. A man might carve a charm and leave it in a place she'd find it. She might sing near where he worked, letting her voice rise just a little on certain notes. Not obvious, never obvious, but clear if you were paying attention. And often, someone was. Sometimes the fire in the hall was not enough, and small candles would be lit. Animal fat, linen wick, trembling flames. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video, and consider subscribing only if it feels right. In that soft light, faces changed. Shadows played gently over cheekbones and brows. Eyes caught reflections and held them. A room of neighbors and cousins could suddenly feel like a dream, with the one you'd been watching cast in flickering gold. There were no pickup lines. There was timing. There was kindness. There was the courage to stand next to someone just a moment longer than necessary. And there was gossip. Oh, there was always gossip. Not the sharp, cruel kind, but the knowing smiles, the nudges at the well. Did you see how she passed him the bread? Kind. In a place where everyone knew everyone, affection was never a secret. Just something sacred that people pretended not to see. Fathers and mothers noticed. They had to. Marriage was not just romance. It was trade, survival, alliances. But still, they remembered their own glances, their own candlelight. So often, they let things be, at least for a little while. And in that time, something grew. Not passion, perhaps. Not yet, but familiarity. A rhythm. He brought wood when he didn't need. 2. She mended a tear in his cloak without asking. They shared stories on long walks, or peeled vegetables side by side, or sat without speaking, watching the frost gather at the edges of the world. These were the spaces where courtship lived, not in heat, but in warmth. Sometimes it didn't last. Feelings shifted. Someone moved. Someone changed. And the combs were returned, or never mentioned again. The carving tucked into a pocket and forgotten. But even then, it had been real, even if it never turned into anything more than a look. A shared laugh. A moment. And sometimes it did. 2 bodies curled under one blanket. Familiar now. A fire between them, but also something else. The sense that you've been seen. Not just looked at, truly seen. No vows. Number. Poems. Just a quiet agreement formed between skin and silence. Even in a world of storms, of axes, of endless winter. Love still came. Like a flickering flame that needed shelter. And if it found it in a glance, a carved gift, a laugh at the right time, it could burn quietly. For years. Marriage was not a TEUNDERCLA. It was a long, slow snowfall. 1 flake at a time, barely noticed until the world was covered in it. It didn't begin with passion. Often, not even with choice. But with necessity, with 2 families shaking hands over firelight, with goats traded, with fields joined. And then, with waking up beside the same breath, every morning, forever. There was no wedding dress, no diamond ring, just a woven band, a fur cloak, a nervous glance across a smoky hall. The ceremony, if there was one, ended quickly. What came next was the real work. 2 people sharing chores, space, skin, and silence. It began awkwardly. Not always unkind, but unfamiliar. A stranger's elbow knocking yours as you reached for the same ladle. The sound of someone else snoring. In the dark. The realization that you'd be splitting wood for them now. For winters and winters to come. But time softened things. Not like butter, like stone. Slowly, reluctantly, permanently. You learned the rhythms. That she hummed while she kneaded dough. That he sniffed the air before it snowed. That when one was angry, they chopped wood harder. That when one was sad, they went quiet. Not out of coldness, but out of habit. And still, you stayed. Not because it was always good, But because it was shared, love, if it came, was not declared. It was noticed in how he mended her shoe with more care than his own, and how she remembered which bread crust he liked best, and how they argued without yelling, because they'd long ago used up the need to win. They knew each other's habits. She'd pick straw from his hair before guests arrived. He'd bring her water without being asked. These things added up, like drops of rain wearing down stone. They didn't hold hands in public. That wasn't their way. But they moved around each other like constellations, fixed, familiar, always returning to the same quiet orbit. They raised children sometimes, buried them sometimes. They fed goats, repaired roofs, slept close enough to hear each other's dreams. There were fights, of course, over firewood, over spilled broth, over silence that lasted too long. But the fights didn't always matter. What mattered was the chopping done after, the cloak draped quietly over shoulders that had been left cold. They spoke less as the years passed, not because there was nothing to say, but because they'd already said it, in glances, in gestures. In survival. Marriage, for them, was not poetry. It was prose. Long, plain, sometimes clumsy, but full of meaning. A good marriage didn't shine. It didn't sparkle. It held. It warmed. It stayed when the roof leaked and the knees ached and the days got shorter and the cold got cruel. At night, when the fire dimmed and the house settled into sighs and creaks, they reached for each other. Not urgently, not even consciously. Just a touch, a hand on a back, a foot on a calf, to say, still here, still us. And in that small, tired touch, there was more loyalty than in 1,000 vows. They grew old like trees, weathered, bent, rooted. They knew what the other was thinking, sometimes before they did. They'd finish each other's stories, or better, not finish them. Just let the silence say the rest. No one sang songs about their kind of love. There were no ballads, no feasts in their honor, but every winter they endured together was its own kind of verse. And every morning they rose, side by side, sore and stiff and still choosing each other, was its own ceremony. Marriage was not a fire. It was the coals, quiet, constant, waiting for the next bit of wood, still burning. Even in the dark, love did not arrive in flowers. It arrived in firewood, stacked before the first snow, in fish scaled and cleaned without being asked, in boots dried near the hearth for someone else's feet. It was not spoken often, if ever, but it was there, in the quiet work of noticing. A Norse life was not filled with declarations. It was filled with tasks. And if you wanted to know who someone cared about, you didn't listen to their words. You watched their hands. Who they helped, who they fed first, whose cloak they patched before the storm rolled in. He didn't say he loved her. He repaired the fence so the goats wouldn't get out while she was out walking. She didn't whisper sweet things. She made his favorite broth when his cough came back, and then refilled the bowl before he could ask. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was practical. And quietly enormous. She tied her husband's belt in the morning, because he always forgot the second knot. He laid out her shoes near the fire before bed, because she hated putting on cold leather. These small things, unnoticed by the world, became the architecture of affection. Affection that had no reason to pretend. No time for poetry, but plenty of time for potatoes. It was not a grand love, the kind carved into runnestones or remembered in saga, but it was the kind that held up the roof and fed the children. The kind that remembered how many berries someone liked in their porridge. They laughed, sometimes. Not the kind of laughter that fills a hall, but a quiet chuckle during the chores, a muttered joke while sweeping ash, a kind of shared joke that no one else would understand, built from years of rhythm, repetition, and inside glances. If she needed water, he filled the bucket before she asked. If he cut himself splitting wood, she stitched it, scolded him softly, and made sure to leave his share of dinner aside. Nothing needed to be said. That was the point. Sometimes she would be brushing her hair, and he would pass behind her. Not to kiss her or even touch her, just a glance, a soft look, a reminder, I still see you. And when she caught it, just barely, she smiled. Not because it was romantic, but because it was real. They made things together. Not castles or ballads, but shoes, shells, children, soup. That was the true legacy. Things that stayed after the feelings faded or deepened, or simply became part of the background, like the steady hum of the fire. And even when things went wrong, when tempers frayed or days grew long, they kept doing things for each other. Not because it was easy, but because it was how love survived, through action, through effort, through doing what needed to be done. For someone else. And on the rare quiet day, when the wind didn't bite and the chores were done early, they might sit outside together, not to talk, just to rest, side by side, in the same silence, in the same direction. That was intimacy too. And maybe, if the mood was right and the fire was kind, he might pluck a piece of hay from her sleeve. She might pretend not to notice, but she would. It's easy to forget how love looks when it isn't performed. But in the Viking world, it was a boiled shirt, a mended strap, a slice of bread left aside, not hearts carved into trees, but fish cleaned before dawn, feet warmed without asking, a home held up by hands too tired to hold each other, but holding everything else. When love was practical, it lasted because it was woven into the things they needed most. And because it was never about saying the words, only about living them. She did not wear white. She wore wool, stained and layered, thick with years of smoke, herbs, and time. Her hands were not soft. They were firm, cracked, and certain. She had held more pain than most warriors, but she did not speak of it. She had no need to. They called her the midwife. But she was more than that. She was the one who arrived before the screaming began, and stayed after it ended. She came by moonlight often, when the village was sleeping, when the stars were bright enough to see the path by, when only the wolves and the worried stayed awake. She carried with her a satchel, small, fraying hat. The seams. Inside were things no one asked about. Dried leaves that crumbled at a touch, small carved tools, soft cloths, and string. No magic, perhaps, but something close. The birthing room was never clean. It was warm, if they were lucky, lit by a single flickering flame. A small corner, cleared of children and men, quiet but full of waiting. Always, always full of waiting. She said little. Instead, she watched the mother's breath, watched the way her hands clenched, the rhythm of her moans. She listened, not to the noise, but to the silence in between. That's where the truth lived. No one knew her story. Not really. Some said she had 5 children. Others said none. That she'd buried a husband, or 3. That she had once lived with the Sami, or the gods, or alone. The truth changed with the wind, and she never corrected it. But when the time came, when the groaning gave way to gasping, when the woman's hands reached out, not knowing what they wanted, the midwife was already there, holding, steadying, whispering only when needed. And when the baby came, wet, trembling, unsure of this cold new world, it was her arms that welcomed it first. She wiped the eyes. She cleared the mouth. She cut the cord, not with ceremony, but with quiet reverence. She held the child up to the firelight and murmured something only she could hear. Sometimes there was joy, A baby that cried strong and loud. A mother that laughed even through tears. A father waiting just outside, pretending not to listen, but already carving the name in his mind. Sometimes there was not. Sometimes the fire was too dim, the breath too shallow, the silence too long. And then she stayed. She stayed to wrap the small body in soft cloth, to place it gently beside the mother's hand, to speak words not meant to comfort, but to hold. She did not cry. That was not her role. But her hands moved slower, her gaze a little lower, and in that there was grief. She had done this many times. More than anyone knew, more than anyone asked. Each time left something behind in her, a memory stitched between her ribs, quiet as breath. But she kept going, because someone had to, and because somewhere, someone else would need her. A girl, barely old enough to be called a woman. A second child born too soon. A mother who screamed not in fear but in fury, because the pain had lasted too long, and no one understood. Except her. The midwife always understood. She didn't carry books, only memory, the kind passed down from women before her. How to turn a breech baby, how to soothe burning fever, how to know when a silence meant danger, how to listen to a mother's heartbeat and know the truth before anyone else. She worked with what she had, cloth boiled in water, herbs crushed into paste, her own voice humming like a lullaby that never needed words. When it was done, when the mother was resting and the child fed or gone, she would collect her things, quietly. She might take a bowl of broth. She might not. She always thanked the fire. And then she walked home, alone, under the moon that had watched it all. They did not celebrate her. They did not sing her name, but every life in that village had passed through her hands, and every death, too. She was not a hero. She was something older, a witness, a keeper, a soft place between pain and peace. And when she finally slept, hours later, curled beneath layers of patched wool, she dreamed not of gods or glory, only of breath, and of holding on. Desire is not wait for permission. It blooms in quiet corners, in glances too long, in the stillness between footsteps. Even in the cold, especially in the cold, longing found its way through. And in Viking villages, where everything was watched, whispered, measured, some desires had to hide. Not all love looked like a man and a woman joined beneath firs in a firelit hall. Some love lived in stables, or beside rivers, or in the space between two beds. It whispered at the edges of what was allowed, not because it was wrong, but because it didn't fit into the story others wanted to tell. A girl might have stared too, long at another girl while braiding her hair. A boy might have looked at his best friend's hands with a kind of hunger he didn't understand. Nothing was said, but something was felt. And sometimes, something was done. There were places, not secret rooms, those didn't exist, but corners, behind wood piles, barn lofts filled with hay, thick woods where people gathered mushrooms or each other. There, away from the weight of names and rules, people could be what they were, if only for a moment. They didn't use the words we use now. There was no vocabulary for it, only silence and breath. And the way someone touched your shoulder and didn't let go. It wasn't always safe. Some were caught. Some were punished, not always by law, but by coldness, by exclusion, by being left off the guest list, by eyes that once smiled now turning away. And so, most simply, hid. Desire became a private thing, a secret carried like a stone in the pocket, always there, always pressing, never quite visible. Even between men and women, not every touch was permitted. A married woman glancing at a visitor too long, a boy reaching for a widow's hand. These things had consequences. But that didn't mean they didn't happen. It's easy to believe that people in the past wanted less, that they were too busy, too cold, too practical. But the truth is, the body doesn't care about history. It burns all the same. Sometimes, a love bloomed that could never be named. Two people who felt the same, but spoke of it only once, in a moment behind a shed, with the wind loud enough to drown their voices. They never touched again. But they remembered. The memory of it warmed them, sometimes more than a fire ever could. Desire, when denied, doesn't disappear. It folds itself into other things. A song sung too slowly, a letter never sent, a wooden spoon carved with a symbol that only two people understand. There were those who lived entire lives like this, who married who they were told to, who raised children, did chores, made small talk, all while carrying a love they were never allowed to show. Their grief was not loud. It was the kind that settled deep, like snow inside a boot, numbing, constant, endured, but not all forbidden's desires. Ended in sorrow. Sometimes, two people found each other, truly found each other, and decided to risk being seen, to walk too close, to whisper when they should be quiet, to meet often enough that people stopped asking why, and then to stop caring if they did. There was strength in that. Not the kind sung about, but the kind that allows a person to love. Anyway, in spite of rules, in spite of danger, in spite of fear, sometimes in the right village, under the right roof, with the right people. No one said a word. They let it be. Two women living together, raising goats and children. Two men who always worked the fields side by side. An older woman who never married but was invited to every wedding, who brought the best bread and the kindest laughter. They were loved, even if their love was never named, because even the coldest places have warm hearts, hidden in plain sight. And even forbidden things, when kept alive, can bloom. Desire is patient, that hides in places the world forgets to look, under hay, behind doors, inside songs. It waits, and sometimes it is seen. And when it is, it does not shout. It just exhales. The gods were not far away. They were in the steam rising from the stew pot, in the crack of thunder, in the shadow of ravens overhead. The Norse gods lived in everything, especially in desire, because in their world, love and longing were not human flaws. They were divine echoes. Freya, golden, fierce, and far more than beauty, knew what it meant to want. She rode into battle with tears that turned to gold, but she also watched the world through longing eyes. Freyr, her brother, was no stranger to it either, the god of fertility, fields, and the silent ache of a touch not yet given. To the Norse, pleasure was not shameful. It was sacred. They did not whisper about the body as if it were a secret. They saw it as a tool of the gods, a vessel, a place where storms could gather and warmth could grow. To lie with someone under furs or stars was not just survival. It was ritual. It was life, continuing. Not everyone prayed the same. Some lit small fires. Some carried talismans. Others offered silent thanks, not with words, but with closed eyes and open palms. There were no commandments, only customs. And the line between flesh and spirit was not as thick as we might think. Woman might tie a piece of red thread around her wrist, asking Freya for a gentle lover. A man might whisper into the earth, hoping for strength or gentleness, or both. They believed that gods touched the world through people, and sometimes through the skin. Bed sheets, if you could call them that, were not symbols of innocence or guilt. They were linen, wool, or fur, often scratchy, sometimes patched, always real. They were the stage for rituals both sacred and simple. Child-making, comfort, warmth, memory. And the gods watched it all, not in judgment, but in familiarity. They too had loved and lost, slept and stirred, desired and wept. Their stories were filled with hunger, not just for battle or power, but for closeness, for someone to see them, to hold them. Even just once. It was said, Freya wept for the lovers she'd lost, that her tears turned to amber, washed ashore like grief polished by waves, that those who mourned at night did not do so alone. She wept with them. So when a woman lay sleepless, aching from absence or fear, the gods heard. When a man traced a memory into the edge of the blanket, the gods watched. And when two people touched not out of lust, but loneliness, they were not mocked. They were honored. There were tales passed from elder to child, not just of war or wisdom, but of passion, of gods disguising themselves to chase love, of women who refused kings for kindness, of tricksters who changed form, changed hearts, and still wanted the same things, to be held. These stories shaped the way people understood themselves. They were not told with shame. They were told with laughter, with raised brows, with knowing glances passed around the fire after the children had fallen asleep. Desire wasn't hidden. It was human, and it was divine. The bed was never just a bed. It was a space where gods might pause, where a prayer might rise like breath, where something larger than the moment might press close. And afterward, whether it was good or awkward or forgettable, it was enough, because even ordinary touch carried the weight of myth. Kiss could echo a saga. A moan could be a hymn. Not all believed, of course. Some scoffed at gods, or ignored them, or only remembered them in the hard seasons. But even then, when they lay in bed beside someone, or alone, they knew something bigger than them had shaped this moment. The longing, the comfort, the warmth that came and went, even the silence, especially the silence, because sometimes the gods didn't speak, they just listened. From the corners, from the smoke, from the bedsheets, still warm. Not all touches were welcome. Not all touches were spoken of. In the Viking world, as in our own, there were rules, some carved in law, many written only in glances. Boundaries formed not from ink, but from breath held too long, from a hand pulled away too quickly. And what could not be said was still known. Touch was powerful, not just in its pleasure, but in its consequence. A hand on a shoulder could mean friendship. A hand on the same shoulder in a different place at a different time could mean scandal or danger or worse. And so they learned caution early. Children were taught what touches meant, who could offer them, who could not, what was safe, what was watched. A soft rule book passed down with looks and whispers. Women especially lived by these rules. A touch on the waist, on the wrist, on the cheek, any could be misunderstood or purposely misread, and the price was never shared equally. Men could joke, laugh, brag, but women were expected to know better, to deflect, to disappear, to say no without saying no, because saying it too loudly could make things worse. There were stories, quiet ones, about a girl who said too much, about a boy who touched without asking, about a woman who fought back and was never invited to the feast again. These stories were not lessons, they were warnings, softly lit, carefully told, and always unfinished. And yet, touch was still needed, still longed for, still beautiful in the right moment. The right hand's. It was how people said, I'm here. I see you. You matter. But because it could mean so much, it was guarded. A friend might brush your arm by accident, or not by accident, and you'd wonder for days what it meant. A stranger's knee might touch yours at a gathering, and you'd pretend not to notice, even as your heartbeat shifted in its rhythm. Between married people, touch became a language. A hand at the small of the back, a tug of a sleeve, a glance before sitting down. They spoke with elbows and nods and nudges. They learned each other's limits and leaned into them gently, but outside of that bond, it became risk. And so, desire disguised itself not in favors, in shared work, in gifts with no reason. A carved spoon, a bit of combed wool, a loaf of bread, with a slightly sweeter crust. The body knew, even when the mouth said nothing. It shivered differently. It leaned closer without permission. It remembered hands long after they were gone. Still, there were those who crossed the line, not with romance, but with power. A merchant grabbing too tight, a cousin who never listened, a man who confused silence with agreement. And then, the rules no longer protected. The village would murmur. The women would whisper. The men would shift their gaze and say little. Justice, if it came, was uneven and slow. So the people learned to watch for one another. To notice the girl who suddenly walked alone. To sit beside the boy who stared at the fire too long. To offer space or safety or stories. The kind that gently reminded, you are not alone. Not really. There were taboos. Loves that were not allowed. Touches that defied tradition. Not always punished, but always seen. And yet, even these, like weeds through stone, sometimes bloomed. Because the body wants what it wants. And the heart, for all its softness, can be stubborn. In the spaces between law and love, people found their way. Not always safely. Not always happily. But truly. And when touch was offered gently, without assumption, without demand, it became a kind of grace. A hand reached out not to take, but to ask. A pause before the brush of fingers. A question asked in silence, and sometimes answered. In a world of cold and war, and rules carved harder than frost, such moments glowed. They were not always remembered in stories, but they were remembered by the skin, because the skin does not forget kindness, nor does it forget harm. And every touch, every silence, every look meant something. Virginity was not just a state of being, it was a currency, a burden, a veil wrapped tightly around the lives of young women, and sometimes young men, without ever asking if they wanted it. It was whispered about more than it was spoken of, watched more than it was understood, its presence assumed, its loss mourned, often by those who had no part in the story. For girls, it began early. Before they even knew the shape of their own bodies, others had decided what those bodies were worth. A father's gaze lingered longer. A mother's hand moved faster to cover a smile that was too bright, a laugh that drew too much attention. The village watched, always. Because a maiden untouched was valuable, not in spirit, but in livestock, in land, in alliances. A daughter was a promise, sealed in linen, traded in silence, judged by what she had not done. She learned to move carefully, to laugh a little softer, to never be alone too long with anyone, not her brother or mother. Not because she was afraid, but because others might be watching. And once the watching began, the whispering was close behind. A walk with a boy, a glance at a feast, a smile that lasted a second too long. They were marks, tiny cracks in a reputation that was meant to stay whole and shining until the moment it was given or taken on the proper night. Some girls believed in it, held it close like a sacred thing, a gift to be unwrapped only when the gods, or their family, said so. They wove pride into their restraint, dignity into every turned-away glance. But others felt only weight. Heavy as a wet cloak, constant as breath, always on their backs, even while they slept. And what of the boys? Their virginity was not prized. It was teased, dismissed, laughed at around fires. But still, it mattered in smaller, quieter ways. A boy who waited was questioned. A boy who hesitated was watched. In this world, purity was not about protection. It was about perception. A girl caught too soon could lose everything. Her match, her future, her name. A boy who took too soon might be forgiven, might even be admired. The scales never balanced, but still they longed. They were human. They laid awake and wondered what it would feel like. Not just the act, but the aftermath. Would they be changed? Would the gods see them differently? Would their parents? Some, brave or reckless or simply in love, went ahead anyway. Slipped into each other's arms in the hay, in the dark, under blankets thick with dust and daring. Sometimes it ended in tenderness, other times in silence, and occasionally in consequences they would carry forever. A swelling belly, a broken promise, a name whispered with pity instead of pride. The shame fell like snow, quiet, heavy, impossible to brush off completely. And yet, virginity itself was invisible. It could not be seen. It could only be claimed, or accused, or assumed. And that made it dangerous. Some girls were branded as ruined for nothing more than a rumor. Others were hidden away after a secret was discovered. Some families forgave, others didn't. And in between, the girls simply endured. But not all stories ended in sorrow. Some found partners who didn't care, who saw the body as it was, a place to be shared, not judged, who touched with reverence, not expectation, who knew that love was more than linen sheets and wedding nights. And when those moments came, if they came, the weight lifted, at least for a while. Not because virginity was lost, but because, finally, it had stopped being carried. In truth, the gods never asked for it. The earth did not care. The fire still warmed them. The rain still touched their skin. It was only people who had built this. Weight passed it from hand to hand like a stone shaped to fit into a fist. And slowly, some began to set it down. To say, I am more than what I have or haven't done. I am more than what others think I gave away. I am here, still whole, still worthy. In a world of thatched roofs and harsh winters, survival was already hard enough. And so, when love did come, kind, warm, chosen, it did not ask for proof. It simply opened its arms and held what had long been burdened. Some nights, the fire did not last. It burned down too quickly, or the wood was too wet, or there simply wasn't enough to feed it. The coals dimmed, the warmth faded, and the cold crept in, quiet and patient as always. And in those nights, the long ones, the bitter ones, many slept without fire. If they slept at all. It wasn't always by choice. Sometimes it was the cost of survival. You saved the last. Logs for tomorrow's bread. You let the smoke settle so the children could breathe better. You told yourself the thickest blanket would be enough, though it never was. Those who slept alone felt it most. The cold pressed harder against skin that had no companion. There were no shared limbs to create a pocket of warmth. No soft breath at the nape of the neck. Just the sound of your own heartbeat and the slow creeping chill that arrived like doubt. A widow, a boy on the edge of manhood, a mother whose children had all grown. They lay with arms curled around their ribs, as if that could trick the body into thinking it was held. But arms aren't fires. And silence isn't company. The straw beneath them crunched and shifted. The walls sighed. The roof groaned under frost. And the night stretched wider than it had any right to. Still, they stayed. They endured. Because that's what they knew. How to do. Not every night without fire was cold because of weather. Some were cold because someone had left, or never arrived. Because two people slept with their backs to each other. After a fight, neither remembered how to end. Because grief had settled where warmth once lived, and refused to leave Dot in those nights. The blanket felt thinner. The floor creaked louder. The darker Dot. Sometimes someone would get up, shuffle barefoot across cold earth to add one more. Log or embers, if nothing else. They didn't expect heat. Just a flicker of light, a reminder that something still burned. Even if it was small, even if it was just them, there was a kind of dignity in it, Dot, in lying alone and not weeping, in curling tighter, pulling the wool closer, whispering into the dark, not to be heard, but to feel less alone in your own voice. Even without fire, people dreamed Dot's strange, flickering dreams. Dreams of green hills and warm hands, of summer rain, of someone laying beside them, just out of sight. Dreams where no one was alone, and nothing had to be endured. And sometimes that dream was enough to get them through the worst hours. To morning, to warmth, to light. The next day, someone might notice the way you rubbed your arms, the way your lips looked a little too blue. And they might say nothing, but pour your broth first, or hand you the warmest piece of bread, or let you sit closest to the rekindled fire. That was their way of saying, I know you slept without fire. I can't undo it. But here, this, let it be a little warmth now. Some never said anything at all, never asked for more. They simply became used to the cold. It wrapped around them like a second skin. They learned how to move slower, how to hold heat inside the body like a secret. But even then, even for them, one kind word could feel like kindling, one gentle hand on the shoulder, one small favor, one seat shared. That was how the fire returned. Not all at once, but in flickers. Dot, in the end, no one could go forever without fire. Not truly, Dot. We are not built for it. We need warmth. In the body, in the voice, in the quiet spaces where no one watches. And though some nights will always arrive without flame or comfort, they pass. Dot, the frost clings, the breath mists. But morning comes, and with it, a chance to light something again, even if it's just a spark. Not all touch is tender. Not all closeness is chosen, Dot, and in the hush of Viking homes, behind walls of timber and tradition, there were nights when the fire glowed, but the body did not feel safe. Because S3X, for all its warmth and wonder, can carry sorrow too. Sometimes it was quiet sorrow, the kind that comes from giving yourself out of duty, not desire. A woman lying beside her husband, fulfilling the shape of expectation while her thoughts wandered far away. To the ceiling beams, to the child's shoes by the door, to the feeling of being somewhere else, anywhere else. She didn't say no, but she didn't say yes either. And in that in-between, something inside her folded small. There were marriages made not from affection, but agreement. Her family needed grain. His family needed land. They met at the center, not of love, but of need. And when night came, they lay beneath shared furs like strangers with a shared obligation. Some found their way, some never did, and for some, sorrow came with sharpness. A young woman promised too soon to a man twice her age, a servant unable to refuse, a boy taken by someone who confused want with power. These things were not always spoken aloud, but they were felt. In the way someone flinched at a hand. In the way they disappeared during festivals. In the way silence grew where laughter once lived. The village knew in its own way, knew how to look without looking, knew how to comfort without admitting why. A neighbor might leave fresh herbs by the door. A cousin might offer a sleeping space closer to the fire. No one would name it, but they saw it, because even in a world hardened by cold and labor, there was still softness. There was still care. but not always justice. The stories we tell of Viking life, fierce, wild, free, often forget the stillness, the trapped places, the closed doors, the hearts that beat fast for the wrong reasons, not from love but fear. And yet, within the sorrow, some found strength. Women who whispered together while weaving, who passed quiet knowledge, hand to hand, how to say no, how to wait, how to survive. Men who stood between cruelty and its target, who chose kindness where tradition offered force. Even in grief, there was resistance. Some women refused to marry, chose solitude over surrender, lived alone or with sisters or with lovers in secret. Their defiance was not loud, but it endured. In every line of their hands, in every time they locked their door from the inside, and some, blessed by fate, or sheer luck, found healing. A second marriage, gentler than the first. A partner who listened, who asked, who waited. A slow unfolding of trust. Like morning light after too many nights of storm. They found that S3X could be quiet, safe, even sacred. Not the act, but the presence. A hand held afterward. A tear brushed away without question. The way someone made space for grief to breathe beside desire, because the body remembers. It remembers pain. But it also remembers when pain was met with care. And that, too, becomes part of the story. Some never told theirs. They held it like a stone in the belly, heavy, always there, shaped fit even when it hurt. But even that, the surviving, was something, a quiet act of rebellion, of endurance. And in the morning, when they rose to stoke the fire and feed the goats and mend the sleeves, they moved through their sorrow like a shadow they'd learned to live beside. It didn't define them, but it walked with them. And if one day they found a touch that didn't frighten, if they found laughter in a lover's eyes, if they felt, even for a moment, truly seen, then sorrow softened. It didn't vanish, but it changed, became a thread in the tapestry. Not the whole cloth, just one line, dark, but woven alongside brighter ones, stronger because of it, deeper, real, because that's what people are. Not just what was done to them, but what they chose after, even in silence, even in the dark, even in rooms where fires once burned too bright. It began with a tightening, not sudden, not sharp, but steady. A coil drawing inward, a wave beneath, the belly that warned, something is coming. And in the north, that something was rarely gentle. The women knew. Before the cries, before the water broke, before the midwife even arrived, they knew. In the way she winced while hauling water, and how she sat longer by the fire that day, and how her breath shortened as the sky grew darker. Childbirth, for the Norse, was not ceremony. It was confrontation between life and death, between strength and surrender, between the heat of the body and the cold. Just outside the door. There was no birthing bed, just a space made clear, a blanket laid over straw, water warmed beside the fire, hands held by sisters, mothers, midwives. No husbands usually. Their job was to wait, or worry, or walk. The labor could take hours, or days, or a single terrible instant. And the pain came in waves, crashing, receding, returning harder. There were no medicines to dull it, no comfort but cloth to bite, a hand to crush, prayers whispered between contractions. Prayers to Freya, to Frigg, to the ancestors who had done this before and might still be listening. Sometimes it was loud. Screams. That shook the rafters. That sent chickens scattering. That reminded the whole village that someone, somewhere, was trying to make room for a new soul. Other times, it was quiet. A woman who bore it all in silence, who clenched her jaw and let the pain carve through her like a storm passing through. A mountain. The midwife was steady, She moved like someone who'd done this many times, and she had. She placed the hands, guided the breathing, soothed where she could, snapped when she had to. She knew when a baby was stubborn or breech, or too soon. She could feel it in her bones, and sometimes in her heart, because not all births ended with a cry. Some ended in stillness. In a room where everyone waited and nothing came. A blanket folded gently over silence. A name never spoken. A mother weeping with eyes wide open. Arms aching for something now gone. And yet, more often, life arrived. Wet, red, gasping. Covered in blood and promise. Held first by the midwife, then by the mother, who looked at the small, squirming thing with disbelief, as if she couldn't understand how something so new had come from something so tired. Sometimes she laughed. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she said nothing at all. The baby was washed, if water was warm enough. Swaddled in old cloth, pressed close to skin, where the heartbeat could steady both of them. The mother was wrapped too, in wool, in care, in silence. She would not walk for days, would not cook, would not sew. Others would step in, feed her, hold her, let her sleep. It was a sacred window. Between agony and return, between weakness and strength, between who she had been and who she was now. Stayed outside often, but when the baby was brought to them, wrapped, red-faced, blinking, something shifted. In the way he held it, in the way his voice cracked when he asked if it had 10 fingers, in the way he watched the woman who had just crossed a threshold he could never truly understand. The house changed after. There was crying now, tiny, constant, demanding. There was milk to warm, cloth to clean. There was less sleep, less silence, but also more joy, more awe, more reasons to tend the fire a little longer, even when your bones ached. Children were the future, but not the distant. Kind. They were loud, present, proof that something had survived. The mother would heal slowly. She might never be the same, but she would rise. She would wrap the child to her chest and stir the stew. She would sing or hum or rock back and forth to rhythms older than words. And as the child grew, teeth, steps, words, she would remember that first cry, that cold floor, that burning stretch of pain, and she would know she had met death that night and walked past it. With someone small in her arms. Norse did not fear death, not in the way we think. They feared being forgotten, feared that their name would vanish like breath on a cold morning, feared that no one would whisper it by firelight. When the wind howled too loud. But when someone died, truly died, they were still loved. Quietly, daily, in ways that did not ask for ceremony, only presence. A wooden bowl left untouched on the shelf. A pair of shoes no one had the heart to mend. A blanket still folded the way she used to fold it. Grief did not wear black. It wore wool, frayed sleeves, red eyes, hands that moved slower. It showed up in soup that tasted like nothing, in chores done without humming. They did not speak of the dead every day, but they felt them, in the space at the table, in the silence, where laughter used to be. Sometimes the body was burned, laid on a boat, sent across water or fire. Other times it was buried, wrapped in cloth, surrounded by what mattered most. A favorite tool, a carved comb, a token from someone they once held close, and then they were gone, but not entirely, because the dead had a way of staying, in the creak of the floor, in the warmth of a dream, in the strange way the fire would flicker when you said their name aloud. A man might walk past a tree and stop, remembering how his brother once carved initials there. A woman might pause by the hearth, her hand instinctively reaching for a shoulder that was no longer there. They loved the dead through memory, but also through routine. A daughter might wear her mother's brooch every festival. A son might light the same candle each solstice, watching it melt like time, like grief, like devotion. They didn't always cry. Tears were not required for remembrance. But sometimes, late at night, with the house quiet and the wind pressing gently at the door, someone would whisper a name, soft, as if it could still be heard. And maybe, in a way, it could. The Norse believed the dead watched, that they listened, that they walked with them through fog and forest and fireolight. So they made room. A chair left empty. A story told the same way, every year, as if the one who used to tell it might still be listening. A lullaby hummed in the same key, even though the voice who sang it first was gone. They didn't need to let go. They just learned to carry to carry the weight of absence like a second coat, one that never quite fit, but kept out a different kind of cold. Sometimes the love remained sharper than the grief. You could see it in the way a man would carve his wife's likeness into the side of the longhouse, or in the way a woman would visit the grave of her son each morning, not with tears, but with stories, things he'd never hear, but that she needed to say anyway. There were runnestones, tall, carved, solid. But the truest memorials were smaller. A cup kept in its place, a cradle never reused, a smile that mirrored someone who no longer smiled back. Children learned early that death was not the end of love. They were told, she has gone ahead, he waits beyond the fjord. And somehow, that made it bearable. Because love, once given, does not vanish. It shifts, it settles, it finds new ways to be known. And when the wind cried through the trees, and the snow made every path familiar, they remembered. They had been loved, they still were. And so, they loved in return, even when the arms were gone, even when the voice had faded, even when only the fire remained, flickering, quiet, holding their place in the dark. They slept like little fires, tucked close under wool and breath, curled against the cold, their feet touching someone else's, a sister, a cousin, a dog. Children in the Viking world did not sleep alone. There was no mead and no warmth in it. They were scattered across straw beds, low wooden frames, bundles of sheepskin, a cluster of warmth in the dark. The younger ones snored softly. The older ones whispered stories long after they were supposed to sleep, about wolves in the woods and trolls, under stones, and heroes who never felt the cold. A mother would hush them. A father might grunt. But sometimes, no one stopped them, because their chatter was its own kind of comfort, proof that they were still alive, still whole, still here. Children in the north grew fast, because they had to, because the world asked them to. But in sleep, they were soft again, round cheeks against woven cloth, hair tangled with hay, small hands twitching with dreams they'd never remember. Some slept with carved wooden toys pressed to their chests, animals with no names, horses with no legs, gifts from grandfathers or older brothers, or made themselves in a moment of stillness. Others clutched bits of fabric, torn from an old dress, a favorite tunic, something that once belonged to someone who mattered. And still others clung to nothing at all, because not every child had something to hold, because not every child stayed. Infant mortality was common, a fact, not a tragedy, at least in the way it was spoken about. But when a cradle sat empty, the silence around it was thick. Mothers didn't always weep where others could see. They hummed lullabies to no one. They folded blankets that didn't need folding. They watched the other children sleep with eyes that didn't blink enough. Fathers chopped more wood, stared longer into fires, said less. No one dared ask how many children a woman had, because the number spoken was rarely the number born. There were names that lived only in memory. Children, buried without markers. Tiny shoes never worn. But still, children came. Laughed, sang, spilled stew and chased chickens and asked too many questions. They brought noise and light and hope disguised as chaos. They were cherished, not with softness, always, but with survival. They were fed first, tucked in first, given the warmest side of the fire. Even when food was short and tempers frayed, a child's needs came first. Not because of sentiment, but because of instinct. And when they slept, they returned to being something like sacred. A village might be poor, cold, hard, but a child, dreaming without fear, that was wealth. Even the roughest of men would soften near a sleeping child. Tuck a blanket higher, push a toy closer, place a hand briefly on the top of a small head as if to bless it, or steady it, or remember it. Siblings often slept together, pressed close, elbows digging into ribs, legs tangled. They fought during the day, shared everything. At night, stories, cold, secrets. And in that sleep, bonds were braided, unseen, but strong. Children who survived those winters grew into people who knew the value of warmth, not just in fires, but in people. They remembered what it felt like to be held when the snow piled high outside the door, to be told stories as the wind rattled the shutters, to wake and find breakfast waiting. A crust of bread, maybe, but warm. Those memories stayed, lived, inside their bones. And years later, when they had children of their own, they passed them on, not as lessons, but as blankets, folded, shared, passed hand to hand in the dark. And when they watched their own children sleep, breath slow, chests rising like soft hills, they remembered everything, the names unspoken, the hands once held, the nights survived, and they were grateful for the stillness, for the small sounds, for the simple miracle of a child asleep with tomorrow still ahead. The sea was not always a monster. Sometimes it was an escape, a breath, a longing answered to the Vikings. It was many things: a trade route, a battlefield, a hunger that swallowed men whole. But beneath the fear, beneath the salt and the storms, there was also freedom. And with freedom came pleasure. It began the moment the land disappeared. The boat cut through the Sim, water like a secret, and the world behind it, the village, the work, the eyes always watching, grew smaller. Out here, the rules softened. The faces changed. The body, shaken loose from routine, remembered it belonged to itself. Men at sea were not always warriors. They were sailors, traders, drifters. And for some, wanderers in more ways than one. In distant ports, the night stretched longer. The wine flowed. The language changed. So did the rules. There were no mothers here, no elders, no expectations passed down like heirlooms. Only music and firelight, and the warm possibility of someone new. Pleasure found them in different ways. A laugh that rang through the night like wind through sails. A hand on the thigh, calloused but kind. A dance, slow and unskilled, but sincere. There were lovers who never gave names, whose eyes you remembered better than their voices, who disappeared with the tide, but left something behind. A ribbon, a bruise, a memory that flared when the ship creaked just so. Sometimes it was bought, but even then, it could be tender. A kindness shared between two people who knew how to offer warmth without pretending it would last. And back on land, those stories were rarely told, or if they were dressed in bravado. She was beautiful. He was wild. It meant nothing, but meaning hides. In the way a man stares too long at the sea before turning back toward his house. in the way he doesn't speak when others boast, in the way he carves patterns into the side of his cup, the same ones he saw in a woman's necklace in a town he can't pronounce. Some returned home with more than stories. A sickness, a child, a secret. The sea gave, and took, and changed. For some, it was the only place they ever felt themselves. No father's expectations, no village gaze. Just the horizon, and the wind, and a chance to be something else, if only for a season. And even when it hurt, it healed, as salt scrubbed sorrow from the skin. The waves sang lullabies the land could never hold. The stars blinked down without judgment. There were men who never came back, who chose other shores, who built quiet lives in distant places, with people who never asked why their eyes searched the sea each morning. Their old villages told stories. He died. He vanished. He was taken by the gods, but maybe, just maybe, he was held under another roof, by another name, in another kind of love, because sometimes pleasure is not a sin. It's a sanctuary that not every embrace must be forever. Some are meant only for the night, to remind us that we are wanted, that we are real. And when the boat docked and the boots touched land again, the man who stepped off was changed, maybe just a little, maybe in ways no one could see. But when he sat beside the fire and stared into it too long, or when he smiled too quietly at nothing at all, the sea was still inside him, still singing. And in that song was a memory of someone, or something, that had once felt like freedom. Not all warmth came from love. Some came from something quieter, older, less spoken about, and more deeply needed. There were touches that never led to bedsheets, hands that held not to seduce, but to steady, eyes that met in the middle of shared work and said, "I see you." In the Viking world, life was hard. The soil didn't care if you were lonely. The snow didn't pause because your heart was tired. But people, sometimes they did. There was the woman who brought stew to the widower without asking if he was hungry. The boy who mended the fisherman's net, not because he was told, but because he remembered the man's limp from last winter. The girl who plaited her friend's hair, not for beauty, but for closeness. A small act, repetitive and soothing in a world that offered few comforts. These were not romances. There were no vows, no lingering kisses, just the steady hum of presence, the kind that makes the cold bearable. Two women weaving wool beside the fire, shoulders brushing as they laugh. A father and daughter sharing silence after a long day's work, their breathing falling into the same rhythm. A man and his best friend, chopping wood not for survival alone, but for each other. This kind of love wore no label. It did not demand. It simply was. And in many ways, it lasted longer because it had no expectations. It was found in shared cups, in a cloak offered without asking, in a sleeping child curled into an elder's side, unaware of the protection that body provided. There were no songs about it, no carved runes in its honor, but it was there, in every moment when someone paused, to tie another's shoe, to stir a pot so someone else could rest, to finish a chore they didn't start. These were the gestures that held the village together. Not speeches, not glory, just quiet kindness. Even animals understood it. The old dog who followed the shepherd everywhere, not because of commands, but because of love. The cat who curled into the crook of a grandmother's knees, who purred not for food, but for the heat of a lap that had never pushed it away. There was warmth in friendship, too. Laughter shared under pelting rain. Jokes told over spoiled fish. The kind of banter that polished away the sharpness of grief. Because grief was always nearby. In the lost child, the faded lover, the parent buried in spring soil. And when grief came, It was not a lover who always stood beside you, but a friend, or a neighbor, or the woman who still brought you bread, even when you forgot to thank her. Was they who sat beside the fire. When the talking ran out, who placed a hand on your back and didn't try to fix anything. Who stayed. Not to be noticed, but because leaving would feel wrong. Some people never married, never touched anyone in that way, but they were never alone, because they were woven into the village in a different way, as comfort, as presence, as warmth that came without asking. And sometimes it was these people who were missed most when they were gone. Not for a kiss, never shared, but for the chair they always filled, for the fire they tended, for the way they always knew when someone needed to be left alone or brought close. We speak so much of romantic love, of passion, of longing, but perhaps the love that truly holds us is the love that never asks to be named, a hand that steadies without gripping, the ear that listens without judging, the heart that shows up again and again just to be near, because it must. But because it can. We rarely talk about what they wore beneath it all. The tunics, the cloaks, the iron, the fur. We speak of swords and shields, of braided hair and boots heavy with snow. But what about the fabric that touched? The skin? The layers closest to breath, to sweat, to sleep? What about the undergarments of history? In the Viking world, modesty wasn't measured by layers. It was measured by warmth. Practicality wrapped itself around the body like second skin. Beneath the thick wool tunics and heavy cloaks, there was linen. If you were lucky. Soft, if you had time to wash it. Stiff, if you didn't. Most garments were handmade, from flax pulled from the fields, spun by fingers that knew the rhythm without needing to think. Hours of labor for a garment no one would ever see. And yet, those garments mattered. They carried body heat, absorbed the aches of the day. They knew every bend of the back, every curl of the leg at night. They held the scent of their owner, smoke, salt, earth, and something faintly sweet if the herbs were kind that seasoned. There were no drawers, no elastic, just simple shifts, wraps, belts that tied gently, or not at all. A woman might wear a linen smock, long, plain, sometimes patched. Beneath that, maybe nothing more. Maybe a small pouch tied at the hip, a charm pinned near the collar, something close to her heart. A man's linen might cling in places that mattered little. Modesty was a secondary concern. Comfort, warmth, survival, these came first. They bathed rarely, so the undergarments bore the burden, soaked in sweat, rubbed raw by wool, hung near the fire until the scent lifted, or until everyone stopped noticing. Yet even these simplest things, the linen shifts, the hand-stitched seams, held a kind of intimacy, because someone had made them. Someone had chosen the thread. Someone had sewn by firelight, humming softly, thinking not of fashion, but of protection. And they tore, as all things do. When they tore, they were mended, stitched not with pride, but with love. Tiny patches added, like stories whispered into cloth. In winter. They layered. Not because it looked good, but because frostbitten thighs make for poor conversation. Socks, if you could call them that, were felted or wrapped. Legs covered with woven bands, tied and retied until the chill gave up. And sometimes, under all the fabric, skin touched skin, not by design, by need. Two people pressed close under too few layers. A knee brushing a thigh, a chest against a back. Beneath the wool, the linen, the belts, there was warmth. Sometimes shared on purpose, sometimes discovered. Children wore simpler versions, often hand-me-downs that had been worn by siblings, cousins, neighbors. The cloth grew thinner with each generation, softer, more fragile, but still worn, still treasured. Even the dead were buried in it. A final garment, Plain, honest, no decoration needed. And in that, there was dignity. No one ever sang songs about the undergarments, but they were there in every story, under every coat of armor, every journey across the sea, every long day at market, every quiet night by the fire. They were what was kept close, what was known but unseen, what was trusted. And isn't that what matters most? Not what the world admires, but what we choose to place next to our skin. They did not grow old with ease. They grew old like mountains, slowly, silently, worn by wind and worry, but still standing. In the Viking world, age did not come with comfort. It came with creaking knees, with fingers too stiff to braid, with backs that bent, not in reverence, but because the body remembered every heavy load it had carried. But there was honor in that. Gray hair was not dyed or hidden. It was braided with pride, a badge of survival, a quiet signal that this person had seen more winters than most and was still here. The old were not cast aside. They were not pampered either. They were woven into the household, into the stories, into the spaces between work and rest, where wisdom quietly waited. You'd find them near the hearth, not because they couldn't work, though some couldn't, but because they had earned the right to sit, to watch, to speak only when it mattered, to warm their bones without apology. They carved spoons, told stories, watched over the children, corrected the stitching when no one else noticed the thread was too loose. Their presence was like a low burning fire, not enough to cook with, but enough to keep the room from freezing. They remembered things no one else did. Which herbs cured coughs, which path the wolves favored, what the sky looked like the night the storm took the roof off. And sometimes they forgot things. Names, seasons, whether the bowl had already been washed. And the family would gently remind them, not because they were impatient, but because they had been reminded once too long ago, by the same voice. A woman who had once run barefoot across fields now moved only from bed to chair. But when she spoke, the room still quieted, because her voice had weight, not volume. Weight. A man who once held an axe now held a child, smaller, softer, but no less important. There were aches that never left, joints swollen from years of cold, scars from falls, from fights, from a life well lived and rarely easy. But they bore them all without complaint. Complaining was a luxury of those who hadn't yet learned that silence is often easier to carry. They did not fear death. Not exactly. They feared being burdens, feared being forgotten, feared the day their chair stayed empty too long. So they contributed where they could, cracking nuts, telling riddles, placing a hand on a shoulder and saying, "You've done enough." Today, that meant something. And when they laughed, which they did often, it was a laugh worn smooth by time. No sharpness, just joy, polished by years. The young ones would gather around them, not always because they understood the stories, but because they liked the way the stories were told. The rhythm, the warmth, the sense that the world had always been strange, and always would be, but they'd be okay. In the evenings, when the chores were done and the light grew soft, the old sat close to the fire, wrapped in wool, staring into flames, their eyes reflecting things only they could see. Memories of lovers gone, friends buried, winters survived. They didn't talk about everything. Some memories stayed folded away, private, like letters kept in a box, read only when the heart ached just enough. But when they did speak, people listened. And when they were no longer there, when the corner seat stayed empty, when the stories no longer came, they were remembered not with loud grief, but with small rituals, a spoon carved like they used to, a stew cooked the way only they made it, a phrase repeated, not because it was wise, But because it was theirs, they became part of the house, part of the rhythm, part of the silence between footsteps. And when their name was whispered, it came with warmth, because old age, in the end, was not a fading, it was a becoming.